In the course of our church life series that we have been working our way through for the past 3 weeks, we have been exploring big picture ideas that are not so much the things that Jesus followers do, but the very defining things that Jesus followers are. Our first study was on prayer, how that is not only something we do, it's a practice that we cultivate, a discipline that we work on, but it is also a part of our identity. We are a prayerful people. We talk to each other. We pray to God. We listen to Him. He hears us. We seek the Lord to see Him change our community. And then last week, we talked about how we are a people who not only have a testimony, but who are a testimony, with Jesus at the very center. The sense in which a transformed people that have been changed by the power of Jesus Christ are in this world for a reason. You have got a story to tell. And whether this world says that it is shocking or entertaining or not is totally ridiculous, totally not even the point. Because if Jesus Christ saves a sinner, that is a miraculous story. And if you follow Jesus, you have one of those stories. Jesus calls his people to be a representative witness on this earth. When we read the Bible, we find many different ways that God reveals himself, right? I mean, a burning bush to Moses, fire by night, cloud by day to the Israelites. The incarnation of Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, born in that manger. All of these are ways that God reveals himself to the world. But if you were to read this entire book, page by page, cover to cover, the single most frequent thing that God uses to show himself to the world is his people. That's us. The people of the testimony, the people with the testimony, the people who have a charge by Jesus Christ to take the gospel to the nations. Today, we're going to talk about missions. Why it's so important to us. Why do we have a focal wall in the lobby that has a picture of the earth and then pictures of 10 missionaries that we as a KACC family support every single year? Why do we put our resources into this? Why do we organize ourselves towards this purpose? Why do we talk about this all the time? Well, folks, it starts with the commands of Jesus Christ. At the very end of the book of Matthew, we have the famous Great Commission. Now, the amazing thing about this is the very conclusion, right? Matthew saw things happen after Jesus said this thing. But he chose to conclude here because he's leading us to this conclusion. This is what it means to obediently follow Jesus Christ. The Great Commission begins to read. Here's Matthew 28, starting in verse 18. Therefore, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. This is Jesus saying to them. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And he's going to go on to say, teaching them to observe everything that I've commanded. I want to hone in on one particular phrase. Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations. That phrase in Greek, here's your ancient language lesson for the day. To all nations is panta ta ethne. You can see it on the screen here. Panta ta ethne. That's how it's translated to us from this Greek. When we hear the word nation, what pops into our mind? Maybe like USA, right? Or Canada or Mexico. But look at this word that Jesus used that we translate to nation, ethne. Doesn't that sound a lot like our English word ethnic? From the worldview of the ancient world, right, the countries that we know today didn't even exist at that time. And I don't think that's what Jesus was talking about. When he says the gospel to all nations, I don't think he's referencing the geopolitical entities that we call countries. Instead, he's talking about people groups. And people groups are interesting, right? Because people groups can be very different even in these same things that we call countries. Can you imagine that a people group that live on Balboa Island in Newport are very different than a people group that live in Anaheim? That's not a value judgment. I'm not saying anything positive or negative, right? I'm just saying that every once in a while, my wife and I go down there and we feel a little out of place. And I love those people. And I recognize our common Americanism, right? But it is quite frank to us that we come from different people groups. Can you imagine that someone who grew up in South Central LA perhaps comes from a different people group than someone raised in Birmingham, Alabama? Once again, not a value judgment, just a realistic feature of what it means to be a part of this world. People groups are much smaller than nations, and they are identified based on a variety of different criteria. Sometimes language, sometimes culture, sometimes socioeconomics. There's all kinds of things that play into this. But people actually track this. So Jesus says, make disciples, panta ta ethne, of all nations, of all people groups. Well, what does that task look like in 2023? I don't use a whole lot of stats because then it starts to feel like class and people lose me, but hang in there for a moment. Here are some stats on this world. As of yesterday, they estimate that there are just over 8 billion people on this planet. And there are a certain number of countries, and it's also a debated list. Some people say it's 203, some people say it's 197. I don't have a dog in the fight, whatever. There are that many countries, so be it. There will be a different number of countries in 50 years as there are now, just like there were a different number of countries in the 70s than there are now, right? But based on the best research out there, people say that there are approximately 17,443 people groups spread out through all of these countries that we call the world. Now, here is where this intersects with Jesus' great commandment. Go and make disciples of all nations. There are still 7,386 unreached people in this world. And by people, I mean people groups. What that means, what does unreached mean? Unreached means that less than 1% of their population embraces Jesus Christ. But an unreached people means that there is someone trying to reach them. These are our missionaries, my friends. These are people that we sacrifice for as they sacrifice to go take the gospel to the nations and to fulfill this great commission that Jesus gives to his people. But here is where we take a turn really to give us some food for thought. As far as the best researched estimates tell us, there are still 144 unreached, unengaged people groups in this world. What that means, in contrast to being unreached, to be unengaged means, and no one's even trying yet. No one's even trying yet. Look at this next screen. This is all 144 of them. I know it's small. I should have told you last week. And bring your binoculars. But if you can read that, what you will notice in shocking truth and reality on that left side of the list, 39 of 144 are deaf people groups. A feature, for whatever reason, in this world that needs Jesus is that they are often the most exploited of people and often also the most unlooked. Serious as a heart attack, real talk before small talk. If you want to do something with your life that will never be written about in any blog and you'll never receive any acclaim for it, and you most definitely will not become rich by doing it, but you will do something that will echo into eternity with heaven-bound ramifications. Learn sign language as your second language and take the gospel to the nations. Here is what is at stake, my friends. 144 people groups in this world that don't even have a missionary going to them yet. And so that means that there is no hope. That means that we have a great commission, but we have a responsibility that is as yet unfulfilled. Let me give you right now one action step that you can do today. Do you want to shake heaven and earth? Do you want to do something today with heaven-bound ramifications? Underneath our mission wall in the lobby is this list in paper, so you can actually read it. If you take one of those lists and choose one people group and pray for them today, you may be the only person in this world doing so. Isn't that immense? Isn't the weight of this absolutely immense? Now, don't hear me pointing fingers, right? Back up to that previous slide. Look at what has been accomplished by Jesus' followers in the last 2,000 years. You'll notice there that over 10,000 of those 17,000 plus are reached. That doesn't mean that everybody in the world embraces Jesus, but that means that a concerted effort has taken place by the faithful hands of people with the gospel that have taken Jesus' command to go and make disciples seriously. So we've got the command, but I actually want to take a weird left turn today and discuss Jesus' reasoning for being so serious about this. I want to be a student of the Bible for the rest of my life, and I have been constantly impressed from the beginning of me reading this book till now that God never tells his people to do something without giving them justification, rationale. This is why. And so Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, panta ta ethne. He gives us, in a different part of Matthew, a really convincing reason to do so. I know that was a long introduction, but we're getting into the word right now. Matthew chapter 24. So we're backing up 4 chapters and just a little bit of time between Matthew 28. Matthew 28, that's after the resurrection. The tomb is empty, my friends. I know it's not Easter Sunday, but bear with me. He is risen. And in his risen glory, he commands his believers to take the gospel to the nations. So we're backing up from that in history, right? So that's Matthew 28. Matthew 24, we're just before that. And in this chapter is amazing because, and here's your 10-cent word for the day. Slip this into conversation at lunch and I'll give you extra credit, right? Jesus talks about eschatology. Eschatology is end time stuff. Out of any biblical character, Jesus talks about end time stuff more than anybody else. And he's got a lot of powerful, and if I might just be frank, kind of scary things about this. He links his talk about the end with things that his disciples are going to experience in their real life. But here's where we're going. We're going to see a bunch of things that Jesus describes that are predicated on that call to make disciples of all nations. Let's get into the word. We're in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away, and his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. He answered them, "You see all these, do you? Truly, I say to you, there will be not left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, this happens, by the way, in history. In the year 70 AD, the temple is destroyed, razed all the way to the ground. To this day, it has not been built. But Jesus is going to use this. He's prophesying about the future, but he's also going to leapfrog this event to talk about the very end and what we can expect in seeing this. So there's our introduction. Look in verse 3. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age?" So that's a compound question, right? Jesus just said that the temple is going to be destroyed. And to anybody living in the area, that's crazy talk. So Jesus, tell us. Tell us about what's going to happen here. Verse 4 is where Jesus gets into it. Then Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead you astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, for the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, verse 14. This is where we're going. Let's camp here for a moment. And the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. And then the end will come. Now remember, if we were to back up here, right, the question that the disciples ask is, when is your second coming? When will the end come? And Jesus starts to go through this laundry list of different things. Some of them are quite scary, right? The first thing he says is, don't let anybody lead you astray. For there will be many who say, I am the Christ. Look, this is not like even the point of this sermon necessarily, but I just have to say this right now. If anybody shows up at this church and says, I am the Messiah, if a pastor or elder or deacon or member or anybody says, I am the Messiah, we know because Jesus Christ said so, it's not them. Right? We will not be led astray by error. Then he goes into different circumstances, right? Wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, earthquake, famine. In verse 9, he gets personal. Let's return to verse 9 for a moment. Speaking to his disciples, he says, they will deliver you to tribulation. They will put you to death. You will be hated by all nations for my sake. Isn't it interesting that he would use that phrase there and in verse 14? In verse 14, he said, the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed to all nations. In verse 9, he just said, you're going to be hated by all nations. Sober reality, let's put those two things together. Jesus sends us to a people who hate us. But Jesus came to save a people who hated him. He's not asking us to do anything that he was not willing to demonstrate as an example for us. In the middle of the hostility, in the middle of the craziness, right? And think about all this stuff. Like, as I'm reading this, I see in verse 4 and verse 5 that there's a command that we can actually control, right? The command is, don't be led astray. But then, as we march through the rest of this, there's not a whole lot that we can control here. Contrary to some conspiracy theorists, I can't control earthquakes, right? I cannot control wars and rumors of wars. I cannot control nation rising against nation. I cannot control false prophets arising except in the context of this church where I say, knock it off. Like, we can't control any of that stuff. But here's one thing we can. So moving right back to verse 14, Jesus says, you can expect to see this stuff. But how will we know when you'll return? Here's the thing that's actually in our hands. The Great Commission. The responsibility that Jesus gives his people. Verse 14. And the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. My friends, isn't that just wild? The thought that we can play a part in this story. that we can be active contributors, that we can at least be a part of the movement that ushers in the second coming of Jesus Christ. That's why we do mission. That's why we put resources into this. That's why we're so serious about it. That's why we go to hard places. That's why we preach the gospel and share our testimonies. Because this is one thing the ball is in our court to do, to usher in the second coming of Jesus Christ. People get so caught up with eschatology. Living in Southern California, we've seen it, right? I don't know if you remember back in the early 2000s, but there was someone right around these parts in Orange County that had a doomsday cult who had figured out the day and the hour. You remember that? It was like September 20th or whatever. And then September 21st happened, right? I don't know what it is about thinking about end times, which we should do, that gets people so wonky in trying to figure out the details when we are given by Jesus himself our responsibility. I don't have enough mental bandwidth to waste my time with the stuff I can't know. Why not focus on the stuff I can know? I am a disciple of Jesus Christ, a sinner saved by grace, nothing special in and of myself, and yet chosen for this purpose, to be a part of Knott Avenue Christian Church and to take the gospel to the nations. In fact, let's just take this one step further. I just want to jump forward in this chapter just to kind of drive this point home. We're going to move forward to verse 36. Now, I'm not like skipping things I don't want you to know. Go read the whole chapter today. But for the sake of our time, let's make this point here. In verse 36, Jesus is beginning to bring this line of thought to a close. And he's going to give a powerful caution to his followers. Because he's given them inside baseball, right? Like inside, I guess that's not a metaphor. Here's what I mean by that. This is inside information. This is like from the coach to the player. This is in the dugout, right? He said, look, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. You've got to share the gospel. These things have got to happen, right? And even here, in this original moment where Jesus tells his followers about end times, here's what he says about trying to figure out the minutia. Look in verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven. And wrap your mind around this, nor the Son, but only the Father. Can I stop there just for a moment? Look, our days are too short and our times are too evil. I must say this as boldly as I can. How dare you put yourself above Jesus Christ and think that you figured out the day? Stop the speculation and focus on our responsibility. Look at how he begins to go even further, verse 37. As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days, there was before the flood, there was eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will it be with the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken and 1 left. 2 women will be grinding the mill, 1 will be taken, 1 left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on which day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in which part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would have not let his house be broken into. Therefore, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. I got to tell you a personal story that'll either make you think more of me or less of me. All right? This idea of the thief coming in the night and being ready for it is very real to my perspective. I grew up in Hemet and lived there for a long time, and for about 8 years I lived in what? By the way, what do you call someone who lives in Hemet? A hemorrhoid, right? I say that lovingly, right? To not offend, how about Hematonians, right? Hematonians would say that the neighborhood I lived in was one of the 3 worst in town. To the point where I tried to sell a table saw on Craigslist, and the guy paid me an extra $100 to deliver it just so that he didn't have to drive into my neighborhood, right? Constantly robbed, constantly broken into, much loss in this place that I lived in. And one day at about 3 a.m., I wake up because my brother is standing in my room. I'm like, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "What happened to your truck?" And I said, "Oh no." You see, for the previous 6 years, I did not have air conditioning. So every hot summer night, I would just lay and die in this heat. And then I finally got a swamp cooler. And that night, I turned it on full blast. I don't care about this electric bill. I just need cool. Because of the noise of that, I did not hear the person who broke into the yard, started my truck, drove it straight through the fence and stole it. Found it 2 weeks later sitting in a riverbed, on blocks, on fire. Not a good situation, right? So I thought, well, I don't want that to happen again. So here's maybe the mixed emotions part. I put a shotgun under my bed. I've got no Rambo fantasies, by the way. But I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen. We'll see. 2 years later, 2:30 a.m., Sunday morning. I've got to preach that morning. And I hear something loud in the yard. And so I jump out of bed in my skivvies, grab the shotgun, run outside just to see someone stealing my brother's truck, whom he had left in the yard that night. And so I ran and I strafed the truck and I pulled this guy out onto the ground, and I've got a gun in his face. And I'm like, okay, what do I do now? By the way, I felt so manly. Look, for real, like I know that this potentially divides the audience, but running outside and saying, "Get out of the truck," I just felt so manly. The deal is I had put in security cameras and watched it afterwards. And I was like, "Get out of the truck!" Right? But in any case, right? Crisis averted. I actually gave this guy a jacket because it was a cold night. I don't know why. I can only attribute it to the work of Jesus in my life, right? And I'll tell you the rest of that story later, but I want to get back to the main point. I realized what it was like to have a thief come in the night. Jesus, Paul, and Peter, in their New Testament contributions, all use this same metaphor to help us think about eschatology, about the end times. You don't know when it is, so why don't you stay up and be ready? Now, we've got to connect the dots, though, right? Because what does it mean to stay up and be ready as a Jesus follower with a thief in the night metaphor that's explaining when Jesus is going to return to this earth? What that means is that we are carriers of the gospel, my friends. Staying up and staying ready is sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And by the way, we know that the nations are everywhere. Maybe you live in the sand tract just here down Knott. That potentially is a people group that God has intentionally placed you in. Or maybe you do live on Balboa Island and you're cringing at my corny joke earlier. I've got no ill intention towards you. That's your people group. That's your nation. Take the gospel there. But what we also must do is recognize that though the nations are here, the nations are there. And that's why we support our missionaries. That's why we give sacrificially to take this message of salvation to the world. That's why we train in college to get employable skills that we can use for the kingdom of God. That's why we keep our options open in order to go wherever Jesus tells us. Though it may be hard and though they may hate us, Jesus has commanded us. And all of this comes into this end times framework. Something that we can know because Jesus said it. He didn't tell us which war to look about. He just said wars and rumors of wars. He didn't tell us which cluster of earthquakes to look at. Just that there would be earthquakes. But here's something he did tell us very specifically, to the point. The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed to all nations. And then the end will come. How do you eat an elephant? Doesn't this task feel like an elephant in shape and size? Massive, unwieldy. How do we control this thing? How do we do this? 144 people groups that are still yet unreached, unengaged, and 39 of them deaf, requiring a third language to engage. That's a huge task. I get it. But how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You could take that list and you could begin to pray for one of those people groups today. An earth-shaking responsibility that you could do at Carl's Jr. My friends, Jesus has called us to be a people that take the gospel to Panta Ta Ethne, to all nations. It's not a suggestion, and it is not a specific responsibility just for some. I like the word missionary because we understand it, but this is wild. You read this book cover to cover and you will never find it. Not even once. Isn't that crazy? For as much as we use this wordage, right, in church life, you will not find the word missionary in the scripture ever. Why? Because biblically speaking, there's no such thing as a missionary. They're just Christians. Every one of us entrusted with this great commission. And some will go and some will stay, and that's okay. And some will learn that third language, and others will sacrifice financially, and that's okay. And some will sacrifice their jobs to relocate, and others will commit themselves to being prayer warriors, and that's okay. Let us not fall into the trap of thinking that some are better than others. We're in this together, my friends. And as the family of God, we've got a responsibility, but every one of us does. And here's why. Here's your big idea for the day. Think about it, mull on it. Jesus returns when Jesus is proclaimed. Jesus returns like a thief in the night, albeit. And we're not trying to say, hey, this is going to be October 1st, 2023. We have decided as a group, we're not going to do that. Because the angels in heaven don't know, neither the Son knows, but only the Father. But we do know this, that the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And we want to be a part of that. My friends, if you are a first-time guest with us today, I know this has sounded a lot like an insider conversation, but I hope that you know that, we all once stood on the outside of that fence as the nations to whom Jesus sent his people. And I want to invite you into the people of God with a purpose. This incredible, glorious purpose. Once again, you will never be written about in the blogs of man. You'll never be famous and most likely never be rich, but you can do something with eternal significance. I want to invite you into this story. I'm going to invite our band back up on stage. And we're going to sing to this God who not only saves us, but who calls us. Who not only calls us, but equips us. And who not only equips us, but sends us. And here's the deal. Maybe there's somebody in this room who just feels this uncontrollable pressure. Joe, what you've been talking about, I couldn't put words to it, but I think that's what God is calling me to. We've got 10 pictures on the back side of that wall, many of whom grew up at KACC, who heard that call and followed Jesus Christ in obedience to take the gospel to the nations. I'm telling you right now, this is my personal pastoral guarantee that if God is calling you to be one of those who goes and takes this gospel to an unreached, unengaged people group, I and this church are behind you. And we are with you because that is our call too.